Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an interview with a guest or multiple guests or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's episode, I'm unpacking an article that I wrote called Assessment Considerations, a Simple Heuristic. And if you hear that pitter-patter in the background, that is my dog, Minnie, who has decided to join this episode by running around. So if you hear some squeaks or some pitter-patter, that's my dog. All right, here's the intro for this paper. Quote, discussions on assessment in education often describe summative assessments as a product-oriented assessment of learning, formative assessments as a process-oriented assessment for learning, and ipsative assessments as a self-reflective assessment as learning. Each of these types of assessment can serve different educational purposes, so which assessment would work best for you and the students with whom you work? This article presents a simple heuristic for creating or selecting an assessment, end quote. All right, so this episode is going to build off of the discussion last week on assessment types. So I talked about summative, formative, and ipsative assessment. And so now I'm going to provide a tool or a framework to kind of think through, okay, well, how do I create or select some kind of an assessment? So these are just some things to think through. And if you want to actually read this as opposed to listen to me talk about it, I'll include a direct link to this in the show notes, which you can find at jaredoleary.com. or by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on, just in the description. While you're there, you'll notice that this podcast is powered by Boot Up Professional Development, which is the nonprofit that I currently work for in 2022. But in 2023, I will be working at my website, jaredoleary.com. So stay tuned for a lot of new free resources for gamers, drummers, and computer science educators. All right, so here's from the article, 6 W's of Assessment. So the first section is why. Quote, when creating or selecting an assessment, start by asking why you are considering using an assessment. Your intended purpose for an assessment should serve as a guide for the remaining considerations, as it can help determine if the assessment is intended to inform how you teach or facilitate. Provide feedback to students through automated, peer, teacher, or self-reflective means, or simply to assign a grade. For example, if you're looking for an assessment that can produce a final grade for a class, a summative assessment in the form of a project or test might serve such purposes. However, if you are looking for an assessment that can inform how you guide or facilitate each student during a project or process, formative and ipsative approaches might better serve your needs, end quote. Yeah, so if you're working on some kind of like a coding project or CS project or whatever, and you're like, okay, where do I want to start with an assessment? Before you figure out which one you're going to do, you really need to think through like, well, why is it that you are going to do this kind of assessment? What's the point of it? Like, at the end of each one of the classes that I used to facilitate, there were K-8 coding classes and then like a middle school makerspace. I would have one half of the room, go to the other half of the room, and they would check out what they worked on, their peers, and then they would ask some questions. And the reason why I wanted to do that was, one, I wanted them to be able to see what other people were doing to help get inspired to figure out, oh, that's something that I might do. Two, I wanted students to get feedback from their peers through in-process work, be able to ask questions with them like, hey, what do you think I should add here? Or what do you like about my project? And then three, I wanted students to be able to communicate to their peers what they were working on. So they're practicing talking about their processes and what they're learning. Those were the goals. And so the assessment that I came up with was having that peer-to-peer assessment, self-reflection, etc. But then I also had a different type of assessment where I was like, okay, I want students to be able to come in and kind of have some kind of direction for where they're going and to think longer term, bigger picture about what is it they actually want to be able to do each week, because they had 3 weeks in a row where they were in my class, and I wanted them to kind of pace out to like, oh, this week I want to be able to do this, next week I want to be able to do that. I think that's a very important skill to have. So thinking through this, I wanted students to be able to start planning out their creative processes, because that's something that I found useful. And so I thought of, okay, well, what exactly do I want students to be able to do to help with that? So that leads to the next section of this paper, which is what? Quote, after outlining a clear purpose of why, consider what will be assessed. When an assessment involves the creation of a product or expression, it should focus on the core concepts, practices, and understandings evident within the creation, rather than the creation itself. In other words, assessment criteria should focus on the core concepts, practices, and understandings associated with district standards or community interests and needs, rather than subjective or arbitrary criteria. For an example, an assessment of the Common Core ELA standard, ccs.ela-literacy.w.4.3, quote, write narratives to develop real or imagined experiences or events using effective technique, descriptive details, and clear event sequences, end quote, should assess the development of real or imagined places through descriptive details and sequences of events, rather than arbitrary criteria such as the number of characters in a narrative. Although not everything can or should be assessed, narrowing the focus to the core concepts, practices, and understandings can provide clarity of purpose while simultaneously opening up multiple pathways for demonstrations of understanding, end quote. All right, so let's tie this into computer science. So in the former district that I was working in, I was running our CS group, and we would talk about, okay, well, how do we assess projects that students were submitting? So when we use Khan Academy, students would submit in artwork or animations using JavaScript. And when we would pull up a project, we would have not only what they created, but also the code right underneath it. So that way we could look at that. And a lot of the times, teachers would look at the end result and go, oh, this is really cool artwork or animation. This looks great. And so their immediate response was, oh, this student deserves an A because they made a wonderful picture. But then when you actually look at the code, you see, oh, they don't understand loops. They just repeatedly wrote out the exact same sequence 5 times in a row, as opposed to just using a loop that repeated 5 times. So one of the things that we tried to focus on in this was to not just look at the end result, but also to look at the code. Sometimes there were happy accidents where it looked great, but the code was just not good or didn't really demonstrate understanding in something they're supposed to learn. And so what we'd often do is just look at the code first, analyze that, and then look at what the end result was, so the artwork or whatever. So after you've thought through why you are doing something, think through what exactly it is that you're looking at. If you're just counting stuff like I mentioned last week, with the number of costumes that a sprite has, well, what's the purpose of that? Does that demonstrate a specific CS understanding or concept or skill that you think is relevant? If so, then great, use that in the rubric. If it doesn't, why is it in there? Maybe it can be removed. All right, so the next thing to consider is when. Quote, knowing what is being assessed and the purpose behind the assessment can help determine when to implement an assessment. For example, when engaging in a multi-day project, we might assess understandings prior to the start of the project, shortly after beginning the project, toward the middle or end of the project, or well after the conclusion of the project. In addition to considering when the assessment will occur, also consider when the assessment will provide feedback. For example, an assessment that occurs in the middle of a project might not be useful if the feedback is made available after the conclusion of the project. However, such delayed timing between an assessment and feedback might be useful when the feedback is used as data that informs a self-reflection on how a student's understanding changed over time, end quote. So I don't know about you, but when I was in K-12 and higher education classes, I would frequently get really helpful feedback after I received a grade, and there's really no opportunity to apply that feedback in any kind of meaningful way. And for me, that was frustrating because it was I wish I knew this while I was writing it, so that way I can go back and add in the things that the teacher or professor were asking for or recommending. That's why when I was teaching undergrad and graduate classes, I had it so that you either got 100% if everything was great, and then I'd give you some feedback in the form usually of questions, or a 70%, whereas you turned it in on time, but it's not, there's some things to work through or things to continue to improve. And then if you decided to go back and continue to work on that, you could resubmit it at any point and potentially then get all the way up to 100%. And then a 50% was, well, there are things to work on, but you turned it in late. And then a 0% was you didn't turn in anything. So there are only 4 grades you could get. And one of the reasons why is because I wanted the opportunity for that ability to improve. So when I gave feedback, I wanted students to actually read the feedback. It was usually in the form of questions or things to consider. And I wanted to give them that opportunity to apply that feedback in some kind of a meaningful way, rather than just get the grade and then move on. So again, if you got a 70%, cool. Take a look at the feedback, resubmit. You could get 100%. Most students really loved this approach, and then some students didn't like it. They were used to just getting a 91.4 because of the quality of their work, and then not having to redo stuff. And so they just kind of accepted their fate. But those were all types of feedback that I've described for after the completion of something. What I really focused on during class was assessments, formative assessments during the process. Constantly walking around the room, constantly trying to figure out where students are at, how I might be able to help them in that moment, etc. Now, this kind of assessment was in person, and then the previous assessment was usually asynchronous, via email or our LMS or whatever, which kind of gets into the next section, which is where. Quote, depending on when you plan on implementing an assessment, you might consider where the assessment will take place. If an assessment occurs outside of class, this can allow for more in-class time to focus on explorations and creative applications of understandings. However, when using out-of-class assessments, consider whether an assessment requires access to physical or digital resources that are difficult to acquire outside of class. For example, chemistry equipment, pianos, platform-specific software, etc. And whether students should be encouraged to consult peers or external resources when completing an assessment, end quote. So the where side of things, especially if you're in higher education or high school, where there's tendency to focus on scantrons or tests and whatnot, if you're doing something like that, that might take an entire class period. And let's say you do that every unit, maybe every month. Imagine if you could get like a whole week or two worth of like class time back by not doing the assessment in class. What if you did it outside of class, asynchronously? If, assuming students had access to resources and whatnot. That might make it so students can be more engaged in the class, but to argue with myself, it can also provide some pressures in terms of like more things for them to do outside of school, which for some can be very difficult or demanding. If you decide to do summative assessments in particular outside of school, where it's like a take-home, consider making it open book, open resource, open peer discussion. That models what we do in real life. I mean, how many of you have like gone on Stack Overflow and been like, how do I do this thing? And then you just copy and paste some code and change the parameters and function names, etc. I've done that so many times. I mean, it's a meme within the programming community. So to pretend like students can't do that or aren't going to be able to do that just doesn't really reflect what happens in real life, in my opinion. But another thing to consider, not only like the why, the what, the when, and the where is, well, who is going to do the assessment? Which leads to the next section of this paper. Quote, although many discussions on assessments position an assessment as an act done by a teacher to a student, a multi-perspectival approach to assessments might diversify feedback. For example, while teachers can and should assess students, automated software can provide in-the-moment feedback on individual progress or understandings. And students can assess themselves, their peers, or even their teachers. Encouraging both external and internal feedback distributes the assessment processes across people and software, which can make it much easier to assess a large number of people, end quote. Yeah, so even though I generally don't like automated graders and things like that, they can be very helpful if used as a tool for reflection, which I've talked about in previous podcasts. Be able to go, oh, this thing rated my, level of modularity as a 4 out of 5 or something like that. Okay, well, how can I improve my modularity? Or whatever. Or just being able to have peers work with each other can be really helpful. Not only the person being assessed, but the person doing the assessment can learn from this process. And then having it so that students assess you, the educator or facilitator in the room, can also be really helpful. So each week I had students fill out what their goals were for the week, like I was mentioning earlier, and then kind of think through that. But I also included a question in there that said, how can I, Jared, help you with whatever your goal is for the week? And 95% of the time, students are like, no, I'm good. But sometimes a student would be like, I could really use some resources on how to do player controls. And so then I'd go and find a student or a resource that would be able to help them with that. But I also got some feedback on how I was teaching. Some students wanted more structure. Hey, I could really use some more assistance with setting my own goals. Oh, cool. Yeah, I can help you out with that. Now, I mentioned multiple assessment types already without necessarily labeling them, and then talked about some last week, but that leads into this next section titled Which. Quote, when determining which approach to use for an assessment, consider each of the following types of assessment in relation to each of the aforementioned W's of assessment. Summative. Assessment of learning. Summative assessment is, quote, an assessment at the end of a unit, scheme, term, or whatever, which is designed to summarize student attainment into a mark, grade, or level, end quote. Summative assessment is sometimes referred to as an assessment of learning because it is an assessment of intended learning outcomes demonstrated through performance. Examples of summative assessment include exams, projects, playing tests, portfolios, etc. Formative. Assessment for learning. Formative assessment is, quote, an assessment which happens as work is being undertaken and is purposed with improving the work done by the student, often undertaken in dialogic form, end quote. Formative assessment is sometimes referred to as assessment for learning because it provides feedback which informs future learning. Examples of formative assessments include one-on-one facilitating and questioning, daily journals, entrance or exit tickets, think, pair, share, storyboarding, etc. Ipsative. Assessment as learning. Ipsative assessment is, quote, an assessment the student makes against their own prior performance, so that they are measuring their personal progression against their own previous work, end quote. Ipsative assessment is sometimes referred to as assessment as learning because it is an assessment where students are active participants in an assessment intended to produce learning. An example of an ipsative assessment that can occur as a daily self-reflection or after the completion of a project is a reflection of what students learned while working on a project in comparison with their prior understandings, e.g. when working on previous projects, as well as setting a goal for continued learning. An ipsative assessment differs from student-completed summative assessments in that the focus of an ipsative assessment is on reflecting on changes in understanding over time and setting goals for future learning rather than evaluating a completed product or expression, end quote. All right, so I mentioned each of these three assessment types, the summative, formative, ipsative, last week, so I'll include a link to that in the show notes if you haven't happened to listen to it, and I won't elaborate it on here. But this gets into the very last section of this short article, which is on combining assessment types. Quote, each of the three assessment types mentioned above can serve different purposes that may address your why of an assessment. However, these assessment types are not mutually exclusive, as each assessment type can work together to provide recurring feedback for different purposes. For example, in the K-8 project-based classes I previously facilitated, I heavily emphasize formative assessments to focus on in-the-moment feedback for projects that took weeks or years to complete. However, we also engaged in summative and ipsative assessment as a completion of projects, for setting weekly goals, for providing peer-to-peer feedback at the end of each class, and for providing feedback on how I might better assist the kids with whom I work. Throughout each of these assessment types, I followed up with questions to further assess understandings, as a correct answer, apparent skill, or completed product does not necessarily demonstrate understanding and abilities that are consistently replicable or transferable, end quote. That last point is super important. Like I mentioned with the coding teachers that I mentored in the previous district that I was working in, even when a student created a really cool product and their code was great, we would think of what are some questions we could ask students to really assess whether or not they actually understand why it worked the way that it did. Sometimes it was a happy accident. Sometimes a peer just wrote in the lines of code that worked, and they're like, I don't know what's going on, but hey, it's functioning now, thank you. So having this kind of combination of summative, formative, and ipsative is extremely important. You can assess throughout the beginning, the middle, the end, and well after the conclusion of some kind of a project or product or whatever. So I guess the main purpose of this is to think through the different questions: why, what, when, where, who, which, and how you are going to combine these different assessment types in the different classes that you're working on. Even though I really preferred formative, I made sure that we still had ipsative and summative forms of assessment. It's important to have this combo of them. You might lean towards one over the others, but it shouldn't be, I only do summative or I only do formative. They all have their purposes and places. But at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to share some lingering questions or thoughts. I kind of embedded some elaborations throughout, and then because I wrote it, I don't really have as many questions as I normally would. But one of the questions that I have for you is, what questions or frameworks do you use when considering creating or selecting an assessment? And another question that I have is, what's missing from this discussion? Yeah, it was helpful to have the 6 W's of assessment. That's an easy marketing way to kind of frame things, but what might have been useful for that heuristic that didn't have a W in it? If you got some ideas, feel free to let me know on social media. You can find all of my social medias at jaredoleary.com, as well as some links to other assessment resources and 160 some odd episodes that are solo episodes like this, as well as some interviews with some amazing people talking about computer science education research and practice. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. Stay tuned next week for another one. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.